Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Week 6 lecture on chapters 10 and 11. I apologize for this week. I won't be able to provide a video for this lecture. We are having some technical internet connection difficulties, and the video keeps on stopping and starting, and so to prevent that, I'm going to just record the lecture with my voice. But it's still going to be a good lecture, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it, and it's going to be very useful. So for this week, we are doing organizational change, transformation, and life cycle of the organization. So let's get started. So what is organizational change? Well, organizational change is the process by which an organization moves from its present state to a future state, right? So that's the definition that you see here before you. But if you think about it, it's a lot of things. Organizations change their image, they change their ways of doing things, their ways of doing business, their ways of providing customers with the services that they provide. For example, a government. Anytime you have changes in government, whether it's political changes or structural changes or even financial changes, right, budgeting, you're going to have a change in the organization. So organizational change is a very broad umbrella that encompasses many different things. Now, targets of organizational change include different things, different levels, right? They affect human resources, so they affect people. They affect functional resources, so what you use to turn over or to create a finished product, okay, the functional resources. They also change capabilities, technological capabilities, okay. The change can impact that, and in fact, that's one of the biggest change factors in today's contemporary modern world. It's technology, because we know that technology in many ways becomes the product. When you think about government and the way that government provides its services and communicates with its citizens, technology becomes a very important element in that process. So targets of change include technological capabilities. And then the fourth target for change is organizational capabilities, right? So what is the spectrum of coverage, for example, of an organization, whether it's a local, state, federal, or multinational. Okay, so organizational capabilities, the scope of coverage, so to speak, of an organization. There are other sources of organizational change. And these are the external factors, external sources of change. These include economic forces, political forces, global or geopolitical forces that affect an organization, right? For example, expanding in a foreign market, right? What drives a company to expand in a foreign market? Well, it depends on trends. It depends on political stability in certain regions of the world. If you're going to expand or open new markets in new countries, it might be important to understand the national culture. So adapting to the changes in the national culture also. And then, of course, politics, right? And we know in the United States, for example, we have a system of government which, even though it remains relatively, and I use that word very carefully, it remains relatively stable with the changing of an administration, especially when administration becomes, is from a different party. But there are changes nonetheless. Leadership changes, style changes, worldview changes, the mission and the vision of the administration changes. And so all of this leads to organizational change. How people are employed, what kind of people are employed, what are the traits and what kind of leadership you want in government. All of this changes with the changing external environment, the changing political external environment, which drives organizational change as well. You also have demographics, right? Continuing on with other sources of other factors that drive change. Demographics and social forces, for example, the composition of the workforce. If we're talking about the year 1920, we're talking about a predominantly white male workforce. In the year 2020, we are talking about a half and half workforce. We're also talking about individuals with different worldviews. We are talking about races and ethnicities and religions and even age, right? We find ourselves today, we have age diversity. We find ourselves in a period of history where it's not uncommon to have a 70-year-old or a 75-year-old still working with a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old. So you have these generations, right? These different generations. You have the Xers and the Millennials and the Z and the silent generation of World War II and Generation X, which I am, for example. So you have all of these different generations, and these are also demographics forces that drive organizational change. And then we have, of course, the frames that encompass or that encapsulate, I should say, organizations. So we have ethical forces that are driven by government, politics, social demands. Okay, for example, the creation of an ethics officer position. So you have compliance. Organizations, universities have compliance departments where ethics and compliance. And so if an employee or a student or a supplier, a provider of a product is not meeting or is violating that code of ethics, then the compliance officer, the ethics officer will come in and address that. Okay. We also have something called whistleblowing, right? This became famous a few years back with the Snowden incident, and in fact, there is a book called Guerrilla Government, which talks about the actions of individuals inside of organizations who engage in this type of behavior of calling out what they see, right? Speaking out. Now, this idea of guerrilla government or this idea of whistleblowing sometimes is questionable or questioned by scholars and by experts because it may also be used as a weapon. It may be used against certain people to try to achieve other gains, right? Whether those gains are economic or political, what have you. Okay, so, but in general terms, the organization relies on its ethics and its code of ethics to determine its values, right? What is allowed, what is not allowed, what are the expectations of workers and providers and suppliers and clients, etc. Now, organizations are very resistant to change, like you see in this picture, right? Organizations are like straitjackets, okay? They don't like change. They prefer the constant. They prefer things to remain the way they are. It is just a natural aspect. It's a natural trait of organizations. And part of it is because change brings uncertainty, right? So there's this natural resistance to change by organizations. Now, those organizations that are too resistant to change and that who are not open to change tend to cease from existing. They tend to disappear. Okay. Now, what are some of the power and conflict are a huge source of organizational resistance to change, and this has to do with leadership, right? So when you have a new leader, or you have a leader who has a different perspective or a different vision for the organization, there tends to be a power struggle between the leader and other leaders or followers. In fact, you could also have resistance due to differences in the functional orientation or the structure of the organization, or even the organizational culture, right? Where the culture maybe comes into conflict with the external environment, the external culture of a country, for example. Group level resistance to change also comes from norms. Group norms, group cohesiveness, something called groupthink, which groupthink is not to be confused with thinking collectively. What groupthink is this phenomenon where organizations adapt and make decisions based on this inertia, that because everybody seems to agree about a decision or a choice of a course of action, others who may have a different view will not want to go against the current. They are afraid to be cast out or excluded, and so they tend to go with what the group is doing. And groupthink becomes a very dangerous, and in fact, it can lead to tragic outcomes. One of the most clear examples of groupthink is the Challenger accident in the 1980s. Just very briefly, if I may share with you, I was in middle school in Miami, Florida, and the entire United States was captivated by the fact that Krista McAuliffe, an astronaut who was a civilian, who had been picked from 100,000 applicants, she had been picked to go into space with the Challenger astronauts. And the entire nation was captivated, and all of school children from elementary all the way to high school, all of us were watching this unfold live in our classrooms. And we saw and we witnessed the Challenger explode 2 minutes into flight. It was a really sad and tragic experience that marked our generation. And it was due to groupthink, because there was this need to launch in spite of the warnings and the resistance that had been created by the engineers. The engineers were saying you cannot launch because the weather in Florida is too cold, and we don't know if the O-rings are going to hold up in that cold weather, and it may cause the fuel to leak, and it could cause a catastrophe. Well, the politicians insisted on the launch, and the powers that be ignored the input of the engineers, who were the experts. And in this need to go on with the launch, groupthink was created, where the opinions of the experts were cast aside. And what ended up being was a disaster, a tragedy, where the Challenger exploded and all 7 astronauts perished. So groupthink can be a very dangerous thing. So group level resistance to change stems from these different phenomena: group norms, cohesiveness. You want a group to be cohesive, you want an organization to be cohesive, but too much cohesion can lead to groupthink. Too much cohesion can lead to an organization becoming stale and not including or taking into consideration different points of view. And of course, escalation of commitment, where you become so committed to a course of action that you refuse to consider another course. You also have individual level resistance to change, okay? And for example, uncertainty and insecurity from an individual. There's folks that have that are very risk loving, or some folks are risk averse, okay? So folks that in an organization, especially leaders in an organization who are risk averse, will tend to be resistant to change because of their very low appetite for risk, okay? There are others who have developed what we call selective perception and retention, which is that they see what they want to see, right? And so they only consider those things that will support their argument or support their position or support their strategy. And so this can be also a resistance to change. And then, of course, the last one is bottom line habit. Okay, humans are creatures of habit, and we know, especially the older we get, the harder it becomes for us to adopt new ways. And so habit becomes a problem for organizations at the individual level. We have a theory here that's important for us to consider, and that is Levine's force field theory of change. Okay, and what is Levine's force field theory of change? What does it tell us? It tells us that basically that when we have competing forces, right? When you have two forces who want to decide on something in an organization, what ends up happening is you end up with a state of inertia, right? Where you have two opposing poles pulling at each other. It's almost like a stalemate where you cannot get anything done because you have these two competing forces, okay? So how do you manage this? How do you get around this? Well, you need strong leadership, and you need to define the authority in that leadership, in that structure, and you have to either increase the forces for one direction or one pole, or decrease the force of the other to get rid of this stalemate. Okay, now there are different types of change in organizations. We have evolutionary change, which is change that is gradual, incremental, and narrowly focused. So this is your natural evolution. It's like the word evolution, right? Evolution, where you have a natural course of change, right? People left to themselves are going to change, right? We change from our young selves to our adolescent selves, to our 30-something selves, to our 50, middle of the road self, right? Middle-aged self, and then our older selves. We change gradually, okay, incrementally throughout our lives. Well, organizations are the same way. They gradually adapt to the slow changing environments that they find themselves in, and they are gradually changing. Change can be in the form of image, it can be in the form of symbols, and it can be in the form of the product differentiation, or a political party can change in who it caters to, in demographics, in platform, right? This is your gradual change, which is evolutionary. But then we have revolutionary change that is sudden, drastic, and broadly focused. Okay, and this change is can be very positive, but it can also be very dangerous, right? As we know, we've seen revolutions throughout history who have produced situations that are far worse than the ones that they sought to overcome. The United States of America is a product of a revolution, but the U.S., unlike most other situations around the world, the U.S., the founding fathers, chose to take that revolution and establish a republic. After the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution came and a Federalist representative republic was established, built on the principles of democracy. And it's had some ups and downs in the Civil War and a lot of bumps down the road. Without a doubt, it's far from perfect. But 240 years later, here we are, right? You can't say the same thing for many countries who have gone through revolution. Revolutions end up producing worse tyrants than the ones they sought to overthrow. Now, another theory, and this is a model, is Lewin's three-step change process. And this process is actually very interesting. It's intuitive, and I think it's a unique model because it's easy to remember. And the way that I remember this model is by thinking about a snowflake. Okay, so you have a snowflake, right? A snowflake, when it forms in the atmosphere, as it begins, it starts frozen. It starts frozen, and the water particles freeze, and those particles begin to fall, and it's snow because it is able to remain frozen all the way from the atmosphere, the top of the stratosphere, all the way down to the ground. But this snowflake, once it hits the ground, it may begin to unfreeze, either because the ground is a little warm or warmer, or because it hits a shape or a different situation, a different environment where it changes. Okay, so the snowflake unfreezes just like the organization might unfreeze from its present state. So if you think about it, the snowflake as an analogy for the organization, an organization has a shape, then it unfreezes, it makes the desired type of change, so it changes, just like a snowflake can change from shape, and then it refreezes, and it refreezes to a new desired state. Usually it refreezes because of the changing external environment, which means it because the cold, right? So a drop of water unfreezes, it starts solid, it unfreezes, it changes, right? And then it refreezes, but this time it refreezes into a new shape. So this is an analogy that I like to use for organizational change. All right, so now let's talk about organizational transformation, birth, growth, and decline and death. This is the organizational life cycle. So what is the organizational life cycle? Well, it's a sequence of stages. We start just like the human. We have birth, we have growth, we have decline, and we have death. Okay, so just like human beings' life cycle, organizations have their own life cycles, right? Two examples of organizations who have organizationally perished, I should say, are Blockbuster Video and Kodak. Now, Kodak is still around in some form, but it's certainly not the organization that we once knew in the 1970s and 80s. When in the case of Blockbuster Video, for you, I'm sure you folks are younger than me, but back when I was in college, Blockbuster Video was booming. It was all over the U.S., and it was a billion-dollar company, and it basically sold videos. You would go and rent videos to Blockbuster, and you'd get 2 or 3 movies, and that would be your night. That ended. It ended because Blockbuster failed to adapt to its changing external environment, the changing technology. All right. Here we see the model of the organizational life cycle. We see organizational effectiveness on the y-axis, and then you see the stages of life cycle on the x-axis, and you see birth. You see organizational growth, which is when an organization becomes really, really popular and big and effective, and it reaches a climax, and then it begins to decline until at some point it dies, right? So going back to the case of Blockbuster, the reason that Blockbuster failed to survive was that it did not prepare for the changing technology. It wasn't strategic enough. Its business model was built on technology, and the fact that they depended on technology to be able to remain in business made them very vulnerable to external environmental changes. And so that's why Blockbuster perished, because you went from cassettes to the CD video, right? And then after that, what do we have now? We have Netflix, we have all these other, right, Prime Video and YouTube, etc. And so people are not going to rent movies anymore. At least they don't go out into a place like Blockbuster to do it. And so Blockbuster failed to see that, to prevent that, to prepare for that change. Now, there's also something called the institutional theory of organizational growth, okay? And this has to do with a theory that studies how organizations can increase their ability to grow and survive and remain legitimate, or in fact become legitimate. We call this legitimization, and it's the process by which an organization embeds itself into a society, into a system, into history. Of course, one of the most horrific examples of this was Nazi Germany, right? The Nazi Party. The Nazi Party was a political party, the National Socialist Party, who became embedded, it institutionalized through processes and symbols and worldview and actions, etc. And obviously a leadership style and control and coercive methods, but it sought to legitimize itself, and in fact it became legitimate at one point in Germany because the values and the expectations of that time in Germany aligned with what the party offered for Germany, who was a country who had at the time was reeling from economic problems, and it had also been devastated by the First World War, right? And so they achieved a certain level of legitimacy, but of course that legitimacy was destroyed completely by the actions of the Nazis with the Holocaust and all those horrors that we now have come to know. Okay, so organizational theory is about institutionalization of organizations and how they become legitimate in their environments, and how they also become illegitimate when they simply no longer are aligned with the values and the expectations of the people and the greater environment. A concept called isomorphism, okay? Isomorphism, and organizational isomorphism, is basically a process that explains why organizations become similar. So why is it that organizations copy from the past? Why is it that trends repeat themselves, okay? You have different processes in isomorphism. You have coercive isomorphism, which is what we saw in Nazi Germany, right, where you were forced to obey or to comply and to adapt. You have mimetic isomorphism, which is mimesis, which is mimicking, which is copying, doing what, follow the leader type. And then you have normative isomorphism, which is based on the external norms and values, you copy those things. It's like organizations who adopt best practices, okay? So those are examples. The mask mandate would be an example of isomorphism where you have institutions, in this case government, adapting or adopting these mechanisms, whether it's through coercive methods or because the norms of society call for it. Okay, in this case, we've had a pandemic, and the lack of understanding and scientific knowledge and the speed at which this virus came about made it very difficult for government and for individuals to adapt quickly given the uncertainty. And so it becomes very hard to manage this crisis, right? So what do people do? They go back to what was used before. So we look at our experiences in 1918 with the previous pandemic. You look at things like masks, right? You don't know if they work 100%, but people adopt them because they don't have any other choice, right? We don't have enough information, and everything comes so fast that you mimic what others are doing, as they say, just in case, right? Well, you have advantages and disadvantages of isomorphism, and the biggest disadvantage is the becoming outdated, because you adopt ways of behavior that become outdated and no longer lead to effectiveness. For example, the check. Okay, organizations used to depend on the check, right? The financial system used to depend on a check. You folks may not remember it, but I remember there was a time when we paid everything with a check. I mean, carrying your checkbook was a must when you left the house. You went to the supermarket, you paid with a check. You went to a store, you paid with a check. Everything was check. And who pays with checks anymore? I bet you that 9 out of 10 transactions don't involve checks. And so organizations that depend on this and insist on checks as the mode of payment are becoming outdated and they end up becoming ineffective. Okay? You have the pressure to imitate may reduce the level of innovation in the environment. So, for example, organizations that don't imitate or don't adapt to the changing trends, for example, now with COVID, where people are working from home, if an organization is resistant to that and insists on people coming in, well, that creates costs. It may lead to employees being concerned about health, and it may unnecessarily produce things like burnout, okay, because people are not happy, or because they're not given those options, or simply put, because the organization is not considering alternatives. It's not innovating. It becomes outdated. Okay, so these are some of the disadvantages of isomorphism. Okay, and that is it for this week's discussion. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to answer them. I'll try to get your assignments graded as quickly as I can. And I wish you a wonderful week, and God bless you. Thank you very much.